DC Rebirth has sort of come and gone, but I've decided to take a bit of time to pick up some of the series that I initially missed out on when the publishing initiative first came out. One of which being Action Comics by writer Dan Jurgens. And from what I've read so far, it's been a solid balance between classic bread and butter comic book storytelling and deeper, thought-provoking plot threads for down the line. And there are some ideas and themes that really stand out in the series' first volume that I want to discuss with a specifically philosophical outlook. Because this series definitely took some bold and new shifts away from the classic world of Superman that we're accustomed with. And I feel these changes end up commenting a bit on how we perceive the culture behind these characters. But all in all, I'm really interested in talking about Volume 1 of Action Comics Rebirth, Path of Doom. Now, the plot for Path of Doom is pretty cut and dry. The story kicks off with an odd diversion by some organized criminals in Metropolis. Naturally seeing the lives of innocents threatened, a superpowered hero donning a cape and an S on his chest arrives at the scene to save the day, but soon reveals himself to be Lex Luthor. Luthor announces to the world on live TV that he was in fact inspired by the heroism and sacrifice of the now late Superman, and has decided to take on the mantle of the defender of truth and justice for the city of Metropolis. Meanwhile, miles away from the city, a family from an alternate dimension, Superman, Lois Lane, and their son John Kent, are moving into their new home when they catch a few seconds of Luthor's speech on their television. Aware of Luthor's malicious past, the alternate reality Superman wastes no time preparing himself to arrive at the scene and confront this suspicious change of heart. Back at Metropolis, Lex and Supes exchange skeptical remarks, but we also find out that the organized criminals were in fact causing a distraction so that they could acquire a mysterious tank for their benefactor. However, the tank soon bursts open, and its contents are revealed to be the infamous Kryptonian beast, Doomsday. Seeing the peril of the situation, Superman and Luthor put their differences aside to team up and try to defeat Doomsday, as well as lure him away from the city to a more remote and deserted location. Along the way, we find a surprising appearance by a brand new Clark Kent with no established origin as of yet. We have the arrival of Wonder Woman as she attempts to help stave off the genetic monstrosity. And we even watch as little Johnny Kent learns more about the heroic legacy and history that his parents have sought to omit from him up to this point. All of this culminates to the climactic showdown, wherein Doomsday is ultimately teleported and captured by the enigmatic Mr. Oz, a cryptic and ominous figure who has been watching our alternate reality Superman from afar. And Superman and Lex Luthor have a bit of a more formal confrontation. Now, Path of Doom was the first volume of Action Comics to be released under DC's Rebirth publication line. And being the first for a lot of new readers, it made sense that they try to shake things up from the norm by introducing a heroic Lex Luthor, a decisive and divisive separation of the Clark Kent-Superman dichotomy, and the reintroduction of one of the most famous Superman villains in all of his history, Doomsday. But apart from the flashy and superficial twists from the Action Comics norm, this preliminary story arc of the Action Comics Rebirth series also touches on some very philosophical themes by way of a recurring comment by the reformed and inspired Lex Luthor. The idea of a real Superman. While Lex is very clearly referring to the late Kal-El of his New 52 universe, much of his actions, beliefs, and inspiration for this hero reflect the ideals of a certain Superman from another philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, when the famous 19th century German philosopher of nihilism posited the concept of Superman, originally referred to as Übermensch and translated by some as the Overman, it's important to keep in mind that what Nietzsche was yearning for wasn't a man with physical prowess or power like the super people who we see riddled throughout our comic book media today. Instead, what made a man ascend beyond his current state for Nietzsche had much more to do with his famous corner of philosophy that he is rather infamously known for, nihilism. Now, despite the reputation that the theory has in today's modern discourse, nihilism, as Nietzsche was developing it, was very grounded in the world that he was living in at the time. 18th century Germany was a realm clouded by mostly faceless institutions with de facto rules and norms. And so much of Nietzsche's Superman, as it is understood today, comes from quotes and monologues from his philosophical novel, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Without going too into detail, the novel is narrated by the titular Zarathustra, a famous founder of the ancient religion of Zoroastrianism, as he gives sermons and verses on how he perceives the world to operate in the time of the book's publication, the 19th century. This Superman that the novel discusses is Nietzsche's ideal for humanity. The Superman, in theory, is a person who does not blindly subscribe to the moralities and customs that are imposed upon him by the outside world, but rather follow what they personally believe to be best for the world around them. Because under Nietzsche's theory of nihilism, there just can't be an absolute moral system of thought that functions for every situation and every part of the world. Now, when people casually discuss Nietzsche's theory of nihilism, I feel they often forget that this is a theory of understanding the world and living in it that was formulated by a white, able-bodied German man from the 19th century, who believed he understood society and its functions as best a way as he could for his time. That is to say, this is a person who had a very narrow look at the world and believed himself sufficient to construct a philosophy for how to live in it and its future. So then why bring this up? To remind ourselves that Nietzsche's ideas are circumstantial. I would argue that Nietzsche's philosophy is a philosophy that is best suited for a very specific and particular type of society. One that rather resembles the society he was living in all those centuries ago, when he was formulating his thoughts. A society with rather strict and dictated moral values. Now, as you may have guessed, I'm reaching towards the conclusion that the metropolis we find ourselves in Path of Doom, is indeed such a society. However, I don't mean this in a direct sense. I personally don't have a sociological lens to analyze the city of Metropolis through, nor am I all too clear on its cultural and political beliefs as a general whole. Instead, I would argue more towards the essence within Metropolis, the idea of it as a backdrop for the world's most famous defender of truth and justice. I'm not looking at Metropolis as a literal city, but rather as an idea, the idea of a classic, golden age comic book setting, where the bad guys and good guys are clearly identifiable and signaled through color schemes, poses, and behavior. Now, I've talked about all this to justify applying Nietzschean philosophy to our story. Now, let's actually dive into this mix and see where it takes us. I want to say that I'm definitely not the first person to try and make the connection between Nietzsche's philosophy and the Big Blue Boy Scout. In fact, while I was researching for this video, I accidentally came across an essay in the book The Man from Krypton by the name of Is Superman a Superman? By Adam Roberts. In his essay, he similarly goes over the ideas and life of Nietzsche and discusses their pertinence to the last son of Krypton, albeit in a more broader sense. Now, bridging the gap between Nietzsche's Superman and Dan Jurgens' Superman, we can actually see many of Nietzsche's philosophical ideas allegorized and given representation in the pages of Action Comics Rebirth premiere. For a concrete example, take for instance this quote from Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And it is in the great noontide, when man is in the middle of his course between animal and Superman, and celebrateth his advance to the evening as his highest hope, for it is the advance to a new morning. If we were to visualize this sermon, we would describe Nietzsche's perception of humanity as existing along a spectrum between animal and Superman, with man standing smack dab in the middle. Now, considering the dichotomy between the fictional Superman and his infamous rival Doomsday, a dichotomy that is underlined when one keeps in mind that Dan Jurgens was in fact the original writer to pose the struggle between the two in The Death of Superman, it not only feels sensible to place Superman on the Nietzschean Superman side of the spectrum, but to also place Doomsday, a character who's rooted in instinct, beast-like tendency, and a Darwinist upbringing founded on survival of the fittest mentality, on the end of the animal side of the spectrum as well. Now, the remaining question is, who represents Nietzsche's idea of mankind in this scenario? There are a variety of characters who each grant a nuanced reinterpretation of Nietzsche's philosophy of the Superman. For example, we could give the role to the mysterious reappeared Clark Kent. Now Clark, despite these panels I found to be personally hilarious, just because of how jacked and swole he is in these scenes. Like seriously, look, they went through all the effort to tell us that this is clearly not Superman, but those muscles beg to differ. But yeah, Clark seems to be underlined as being very far away from the Nietzschean Superman as possible, without dipping towards the feral and animalistic force of nature we find in Doomsday. So I'd argue he doesn't quite fit the role of man in this spectrum. On the other hand, we could also grant this role to the young and impressionable John Kent. Just as Nietzsche perceives mankind as still needing to mature and grow out of its black and white outlook on the world, so do we see little John Kent grow up just a little bit wiser about the reality of the world around him, and the fact that he is already half Kryptonian already sets him up as a character who will eventually be able to stand alongside his father as a tried and true Superman. However, I believe the role of man in this allegory is best represented by Lex Luthor. While the reformed villain seeks to claim the title of Superman for himself prior to the appearance of the Kryptonian Crusader, this attribute of constantly wanting to bear the family crest of the House of El is in fact what makes him most like Nietzsche's prototypical man. Apart from that, we find this heroic Lex Luthor acting with his metropolitan community above all else. Instead of pursuing Doomsday once he has left the city, Lex is the only superpowered person who stays behind and helps clean up the wreckage for the sake of the people. And by the end of the story, we even find out that he's bought out the Daily Planet for the sake of ensuring that it doesn't degrade as the icon of the city's image. Acting with this strong sense of community and caring for others clearly falls into the vision that Nietzsche had for his Superman. So it makes sense to see Luthor yearning to commit himself to the community and say, this is the prototypical Nietzschean man. But there's also a deeper philosophical reason for why Luthor may be the best candidate for a representative of the progress Nietzsche hoped to see in mankind. I mentioned before that one of the characteristics that Nietzsche sought to emphasize with the Superman was the fact that he transcended the simplistic and dichotomous morality of traditional society. Clear-cut, black and white, good and evil. And in my opinion, one of the best examples of a character who could possibly take steps towards coming to this revelation would be one who makes a reformation and explores the other half of the dichotomy. Seeing a former villain explore what it means to be a hero is a wonderful example of this, and is definitely the sort of growth and progress Nietzsche would have liked to have seen from humanity. But why bother with all this Nietzschean philosophy? In Adam Roberts' essay on Superman and Superman, he even went to great lengths to emphasize that he wasn't trying to say that the last son of Krypton is necessarily meant to be analyzed with Nietzsche's ideas in mind. So then why bother with all this? DC's Superman has been written in such a way that has lent itself towards a variety of styles of interpretations. Some have leaned towards modeling the character as a classical god, with emphasis on his power and abilities, while others have favored a more Christ-like approach, with his humility and martyrdom. And just as how these more focused and philosophical interpretations of the character help redefine and represent the first superhero in a new light, in my opinion, a Nietzschean analysis of the character very similarly expands on DC Superman and grants us a new perspective with which we can read its stories. But one of the great things about these literary lenses is that they don't just expand our understanding of Superman alone, but also the world around him. I mentioned before that one of the interesting things about the story arc is that we see a sort of apotheosis for the character of Lex Luthor. Now, given that Lex Luthor is donning the role of Superman, this definitely alters our attitudes towards him if we're analyzing the Superman character through these aforementioned lenses. Under the Olympian perception of Superman, Luthor's endeavor to emulate the hero almost seems foolish and undeserving, since most classical forms of storytelling would require trials and tests before a character earns the powers of a god. And notice how this almost flies in the face of the interpretation of Lex Luthor that we just had under the Nietzschean lens. They give us almost opposite views on the character, but they also show us new ways to look at him and understand him at a deeper level. Most every form of media grows and blossoms when we try reinterpreting it and giving it another look through the eyes and ideas of another. For this video, I just happened to try out a Nietzschean analysis, but there were definitely a wide variety of other ways to try out for this story. I definitely encourage you to try some out with not only this single story arc, but whatever form of media that you personally find fascinating. Taking another look at the same story with a different perspective can definitely change the way you understand it. And I think that's pretty similar.